Welcome to the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center and to the second event in this inaugural year. My colleague Ian Miller and I want to thank once again the inimitable Homi Bhabha, as well as the indefatigable Steve Beal and Sarah Razor for making this new platform possible. Between the first event of the year, a visit by Terry Tempest Williams, and tonight, the world feels changed, and the reasons why do not need rehearsing by me now. It is enough to say that in this turbulent and challenging moment, it is an especially welcome privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Jedediah Purdy. I could begin my introduction of Professor Purdy by way of his many qualifications and accolades, from his post as Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law at Duke University Law School, to his clerkship with Pierre Laval, to his 6 celebrated books and scores of articles, to his Pulitzer nomination, and to his Duke Bar Association Teaching Prize. But I won't. Instead, I will begin with a reminiscence. 20 years ago, in the fall of 1996, while pursuing a PhD here at Harvard, I was a teaching fellow in a course entitled Literature and Arts B10, an Introduction to Visual Art and Culture. The head teaching fellow, Lori Monahan, now a professor at UC Santa Barbara, told me early in the semester that there was an undergraduate who wanted to switch into a different discussion section. "You two will get along," she said. We did. That student was Jed, and if he can bear with the informality, I will refer to him as Jed for the remainder of my remarks. Jed was then a senior concentrating in social studies, already plotting his future as a writer of consequence. Having him as a student in the very first course in which I was a teacher was a little bit like trying out poker for the first time and being dealt 4 aces. It is with great fondness that I recall our many conversations lounging on the old furniture in the back of the Sackler building. Jed and his ambitions took hold of the world soon thereafter. His book, For Common Things, published in 1999, blessed and cursed him with celebrity status as a literary prodigy. Bill Moyers said For Common Things was the best book he had read in 10 years. Jed was given the limelight, but also marketed in ways that very often distorted his actual project, which was to grapple with the lack of any meaningful progressive political discourse in the late 1990s. And he has engagingly recounted the bumps and bruises of this wave of early attention in an essay entitled The Accidental Neoliberal, which appeared in the journal N+1. Jed is a writer of great thoughtfulness, compassion, and conscience. An effort to seek a new language for progressive politics runs through his prolific output. His most recent book, and an apt reason for his appearing under the banner of the Environment Forum, is After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene. In this remarkable book, Jed considers the broad sweep of American environmental thinking and imagination and the competing narratives held within it as he searches for a way to contend with the dire circumstances of our time. His effort to move us toward a new imaginative politics and a new habitus trenchantly prods and inspires. Throughout the book, Jed uses the Anthropocene to rethink familiar texts and concepts, from Thoreau's Walden to the aesthetic categories of the sublime and the beautiful. One wonders if the recent election might not require another rethinking. Jed writes in the book, quote, "Democracy has not been doing well. At the time of this writing, the North Atlantic democracies are splitting into elite technocrats who wish they could govern without consulting the masses, and angry populists who would like to liquidate the technocrats. He wrote this in 2015, and one can only say, indeed. Please join me in welcoming Jed Purdy to the podium.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I had a topic, and I will still have that topic at the seminar tomorrow that's associated with this lecture. Then we will talk about democracy and nature, humanism and post-humanism. I threw out the topic about 3 weeks ago in the aftermath of the presidential election and set to work instead on a meditation on this strange time we find ourselves in, this time that the American political calendar provides between elections and their consequences. The meditation that I've written is already in some ways being overtaken by events, as events overtook my original topic and prompted me to write the meditation that I'm going to give you. We're moving already into the need to respond to Scott Pruitt's appointment to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Moving already into the need to see what Jeff Sessions will do at the Department of Justice. If, like me, you do much of your work on an island at the confluence of two rivers, and one of those rivers is environmental law and policy, and the other is the Constitution, your island is going to be in a storm of events beginning yesterday. But still, I've written this thing in which I tried to get some of the feel of the period we have been living through and some sense of the sorts of resources that we have for grappling with it, in part because even as the work of the next months and years comes on, we're going to continue to be, I think, uncertain, afraid, and baffled. And that's the condition that the meditation responds to. It's personal at points. It is political throughout. It makes presumptuous use of the we. And I hope that you will take my first person plural as a proffer only and not as a presumption. I start with a quote. I've lived for the last month with the sense of having suffered a vast and indefinite loss. I didn't know at first what ailed me. At last it occurred to me that what I had lost was a country. That's Henry Thoreau in 1854. He's writing on Massachusetts' enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act to return Anthony Burns to a slaveholder from Virginia. Thoreau continues, I walk toward one of our ponds, but what signifies the beauty of nature when men are base? The remembrance of my country spoils my walk. My thoughts are murder to the state. Where this passage appears in draft in the journal, he adds, I endeavor in vain to observe nature. What does it mean to lose a country? What does it have to do with finding that you are unable to observe, to encounter nature? Thoreau was describing a mind under pressure, flattened and constantly interrupted by noise, by outrage and counter-outrage, by lies that become the law, and laws that become facts, and facts that, uncontested, become the truth of the world. This man, Anthony Burns, is a slave, and he's going back to Mr. Suttle in Virginia, as the Constitution requires. Losing a country meant, for Thoreau, seeing these lies become facts, knowing they were made in his name and that he was part of the political power that made them. Losing a country means losing whatever accommodation you've made with the country, losing your way of living with it. Ironically, it doesn't mean that the country is suddenly far away, but that it is much too close, overwhelmingly close. In this sense, I have also felt in the last month Thoreau's vast and indefinite loss. To lose a country also means to lose a familiar terrain where events arrange themselves, a landscape of what things mean, a sense of what'll bloom or die this week, of what'll come next over the horizon. I think even many of us who are intellectually pessimistic about politics and who don't believe there are natural or magical protections in our old and flawed constitutional system accepted the false reassurance that what happened a month ago was impossible because it was unimaginable. Now that it's happened, I, at least, am often shaken by the question of what else is possible that I have not really imagined. What else have we failed to understand about this place, about one another? Trumpism works on your mind by locking you into the unrelenting present of the president-elect's all-hours social media feed, like the oracular communiques of a deranged minor god. And also by pressing you out of the moment, bending your mind anxiously towards some terrible future that may never come and may already be here. It's both a goal and a means of resistance to take back both the moment and the long horizon of awareness. So June 7th, 1854, quoting from the journal. Another remarkably hazy day. Our view is confined, the horizon near, no mountains. As you look off only 4 or 5 miles, you see a succession of dark wooded ridges and vales filled with mist. And so again, Thoreau tried in vain to observe nature. Or, putting it more exactly, to observe nature precisely that summer was to observe opacity and obscurity, in which it was hard to see and hard to think. I suspect many of us will recognize this experience in this season. Often in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of November, I found I could trust only the days when the sun didn't rise at all, and just enough light seeped through the clouds that the street lamps went dark. Bright days felt deceiving. They even reminded me of a brightly perfect morning in September 15 years ago. We may be at the beginning of 4 years of vigils, civil disobedience, encryption and surveillance, and the tiring reassertion every day of basic facts against lies that are almost official. That's one of the better scenarios. I'm asking here how attention to nature in our post-natural world could still be what Thoreau wanted it to be. Part of our repertoire of dissent and resistance and a support for the freedom of mind that these need. I'm being willful in wanting to talk about Thoreau. He's worse than out of fashion. In her vivid takedown in the New Yorker last year, which was memorably titled Pond Scum, Catherine Schultz, a wonderful writer, called him a narcissistic anarchist whose above it all vanity covered up miserable juvenile awkwardness. The paraphrase. She did not quite say that in the 21st century he would have been an internet troll, but she might have. I think we might instead recognize a companion in Thoreau if we could appreciate how he took solitude and social life both with utter seriousness, because he found that each was at once necessary and also impossible. Alone, you were in the company of received ideas, condescending judgment, anxiety that you weren't doing your part. In company, you were alone in your strange mind, and everyone's mind is strange, throwing words like stones into the pools that were the surfaces of other minds. No wonder he wanted, he said in Walking, his essay, words that had life in them. No wonder, he said in Walden, that the great miracle would be to see through one another's eyes just for a moment, and repeated that drama of recognition with his pond, imagining himself asking the great pool, "Walden, is it you?" No one who writes as relentlessly as Thoreau did about solitude believes in it in any simple way. Writing is testament to the importance of commonality and also to its difficulty. And I'm looking to Thoreau also because I've been hungry recently for naive responses to nature, as I have been for some naive political lucidity. These days, when I see a flock of birds in synchrony, I feel a dimension of awareness has opened up that is not occupied territory. I feel that this other site of consciousness, this fast banking incipient intelligence in the sky, is a rip in the curtain that was being drawn between me and the world. Thoreau's responses to nature are not naive, but they don't reject what's alive and instructive in the naive response. We might find that we need to capture the living kernel in some ideas that can seem to be naive and just cliche husks. In my world of academic lawyers, only schemers even pretend to believe that the Constitution simply means what it says, or that we could stand to live by it if it did. But nonetheless, it's going to be time to defend constitutional limits on the president's power or limits on the power of the police as if they were divine commandments. The artificiality of facts is one of the main things the humanities and the law have to teach our students. But it's going to be time to defend facts against lies, categorically, with utter clarity. This is a return at the core of a web of equivocation and qualification to something that remains non-negotiable. What we return to will not be the simple idea revived, but something that carries and has absorbed the intervening complexity. We return to it not because we suddenly believe a simple idea will save us, but because there's something of utmost importance that we wish to achieve or to defend with it. One of the slogans that got brought out in this election, whenever people wanted reassurance, was this: in politics, you can choose your own opinions, but not your own facts. That turns out to be untrue. On the contrary, in politics, you can impose your own chosen facts on everyone else. This is why the disinformation in the president-elect's tweets, the claim, for instance, that millions of people voted illegally in the election, is not laughable and does not weaken him. These lies are bids to remake reality. A student of landscape should understand this. To have intelligence with a landscape is to live knowingly within a record of all the ways that chosen facts and ways of seeing become the common world that we're born into. A landscape is a palimpsest of how people have lived on it, the violence they've done to it, the things they've asked it to produce. Every American landscape is an archive of this sort. A surveyor's grid of corn and soybeans, a former plantation plain that was first cleared by gangs of enslaved people who were marched across the land in the total mobilization that Sven Becker calls war capitalism. The Appalachian coal fields, reworked by mountaintop removal from severe slopes and narrow ridges and valleys to a broken, spongy, slightly uneven average of itself. The parks and wilderness areas that are geographic testimony to a painterly ideal. All of them. Attention to landscapes has the bad reputation of middle-class escapism, but I don't think it is only that. It was, quoting, a maimed and imperfect nature that he was, quoting, conversant with, Thoreau wrote in his journal. Not less precious or without beauty, but no kind of pristine at all. What could that kind of nature show us about ourselves? Maybe a lot. Maybe a lot about our maimed and imperfect selves and our imperfect polity where we find so many ways to maim one another. I'm trying to talk here about the resources you have when you lose a country in Thoreau's sense. When you feel a sense of the durability and definiteness of things slip away and you want them to be more solid, more exact, but not so that they close in on you altogether. I'm trying to think about the ways we could engage the non-human world as part of our redress for the double sense that the world will not let us go, but at the same time is running away from us. If the experience I'm pointing toward is real, there will be many versions of it. Rather than go into Thoreau's further, I'll give you one of mine, which may prompt you to think of one of yours. I live in the Piedmont of North Carolina, about 2 hours southeast of the Blue Ridge Mountains and about the same distance northwest of the Atlantic Ocean. The horizon there is nothing you would call a horizon. Instead, the sky sits right on the roofs of neighboring houses and on the canopies of trees, close enough that you could throw a stone or a nut up against it. A few years ago, I started dreaming in landscapes. In these dreams, I begin in the Piedmont and I walk up a wooded slope, and here the dream departs from the local terrain. The slope doesn't stop rising. It goes up through loblolly pines. It goes into steep pastures and high meadows. Sometimes it rises up into stone. Sometimes there's no stone, just ridges of meadow. Sometimes there are tufts of beech and red oak forest on top. In each of these dreams, the place of these imagined landscapes is so utterly definite that when I wake up, I've more than once looked up a topographic map just to be sure that these hills are not there. These dreams might seem, I thought at first they did, belong to the genre of the hidden room. In hidden room dreams, which many of you will have had, a familiar house, maybe a childhood home or a college dorm, opens up at the back or through the attic or in the basement, and it reveals these grand new spaces, parlors, ballrooms, formal lawns, greenhouses, interior pools. I have a whole series of these dreams about Pforzheimer House. But I don't think these are the same dreams. The idea that strange worlds are waiting for you just behind a quotidian portal strikes me as one of the most basic intuitions of magical thinking. The portal is C.S. Lewis's wardrobe, it's Madeleine L'Engle's Tesseract, it's Doctor Who's TARDIS, and of course it's platform 9 3/4. But I don't think these are magical thinking dreams. I've been thinking of these landscape dreams a little differently. The feeling they bring is not that some other kind of reality pulses right behind the surface of this one, but that this old one we know must contain places to get above the rest of it, to see in one sweep the many tracks that we usually follow, to merge in one image the many small horizons that we usually move inside. What I'm hungry for in these dreams, I think, is the geography of thinking. My dream landscape, of course, is not the only geography of thinking. It's the one that you might carry if you had grown up where I did, in a very specific Appalachian landscape. From any place that people lived, you could escape on foot to a higher spot. Every settled place contained its own upward exits and exceptions, so that it wasn't even really one landscape at all, but two, a pattern of valleys called hollows, and a counterpart in a second pattern of ridges. And this pair of terrains was joined by steep and mainly wooded hillsides. Knowing the valleys didn't mean you knew the ridges, and just a slight misstep setting off from a high place could land you in the wrong hollow with the wrong people, miles by road from where you'd meant to be. The two landscapes had complementary logics, and moving between them took caution and attention. I feel landscapes should do this. Aid escape from within, side quietly with their own dissidents and refugees. And I also believe it's quite fair of them to exact the price of confusion, the likelihood of still walking the wrong way at dusk in the wrong valley. These dreams of landscapes have been, for me, a way to name the kind of thinking that recent events have ripped away, to sense something about what country it is that I have been in danger of losing. This is a deliberately personal way of talking about paths out of or through a dark wood where many of us woke up on November 9th and have been wandering ever since. But it's not a new or unusual thought that ways of relating to the natural world would be connected with ways of navigating politics, and particularly that the link might be important in times of bafflement and fear. 1727 was an unusually hot summer here in Cambridge, and the summer was followed by an earthquake that Cotton Mather described as a horrid rumbling, like the sound of many coaches together driving on the paved stones with a most awful trembling of the earth. Thomas Prince, who was the Harvard-trained minister of Boston's Old South Church, told his parishioners, "When God has a mind to show it, he can easily and in a moment affright the hardiest creature. He can put all nature, even the great and inanimate parts of the world, into such a commotion as to make us see in a most sensible manner the terrifying actings of his presence, and excite the highest and most awful reverence of him. He can make the heavy and dull earth to tremble, as if it were moved with the fear of its present destruction." Thomas Prince's God had the tactics of a terrorist or a midnight tweeter with a nation-state and vigilantes behind him, dealing out spectacular reminders that no place was safe. In England, too, in that century and the one before it, monarchists and so-called natural theologians replayed ancient arguments that fear was spontaneous proof of divinely ordained authority. Even atheists were scared of thunder and lightning, argued Henry Moore, the Restorationist philosopher. And this showed that all rebellions against established power were just fragile and juvenile vanity. Nature underwrote authority, and fear was her imprimatur. There was a different ancient tradition associated with the philosopher Epicurus and the Epicurean poet-philosopher Lucretius, whose thought was recovered and widely circulated in the 15th and 16th centuries. This tradition was radical and therapeutic. It aimed to get at the root of the fear that Thomas Prince and Henry Moore celebrated, and to disentangle it from the metaphysics of thunderstorms and the political theory of earthquakes. Fear and anxiety were rational and inescapable in a dangerous world, argued Epicureans as different from one another as the grim logician Thomas Hobbes and the sensual essayist Michel de Montaigne, we say Montaigne in my field. But when they led us to seize on myths and monuments for comfort, these false reassurances made things worse. What were the errors of fear, according to this Epicurean counter-tradition? The errors included imagining that earthquakes and diseases had a moral or taught a lesson, imagining that power and hierarchy were somehow natural and ordained, believing in theological principles that obliged you to kill or torture another person, believing in a bright boundary between civilized people and barbarians, us and the others, that would justify you in ignoring their suffering or even license you to enjoy it. When you began to interpret the world this way, or more likely, allow ideologues and theologians and rulers to interpret it for you in these ways, you felt your fear assuaged by a spurious order. But really, you were in greater danger than you knew, and you had become more dangerous to others, too. Hobbes believed the solution was a relentless disenchantment of nature. We could free ourselves from deranging fear by seeing the world as matter in motion and nothing more. No spirit, no meaning, but what we desired or feared. Montaigne, who was earthier and made pleasure a central theme of his writing, argued instead that it was possible for a kind of humane and egalitarian affection to flow between people in the non-human world. He wrote about what he called a general duty of humanity that attached, quoting, not only to animals who have life and feeling, but even to trees and plants. There's some relationship between them and us, and some mutual obligation. This thought occurred to him in the 16th century during the wars of religion in France. For him, this was a disposition of feeling and imagination, a cultivated openness to the multiplicity of one's own emotion and experience, of non-human life, and of human character and action. The most barbarous malady of all, he wrote, is to despise one's own being. And it was people who did, who couldn't control their own fear and disgust, who went seeking after barbarians to torture, animals to slaughter, and became, ironically, barbarians themselves. As you probably know, barbarian comes from the Greek for the sounds non-Greek speakers made, which sounded like nonsense syllables, bar, bar, bar. Seeing barbarians in the world was often a symptom of not trying to understand, and the disposition not to understand was the first thing that deserved to be called barbarism. So today, the same political forces that are trying to convince us that we face barbarians at the national borders, barbarians who have infiltrated the country as refugees, and barbarians in a global war of civilizations between so-called Judeo-Christian capitalism and Islamic fascism. And in saying all of this, I'm just gently paraphrasing the president-elect and his chief White House strategist in their utterances on the public record. Those same forces are also trying to convince us that we have nothing to fear from climate change. Here, the historical sides have switched. It is liberal rationalists who tell a story about the moral and political meaning of the weather. And it's the hierarchical and nationalist conservatives who deploy the little knives of skepticism. Myron Abel, the professional climate change denier, who's running the transition team at the Environmental Protection Agency, is our future in this way. If climate politics and policy fail, it won't be because of one massive and candid refusal, but by 1,000 little skeptical cuts, convenient equivocations, and rationalizable delays. Abel and Scott Pruitt and the rest have figured out that in our post-natural world, the fact of being on one planet, sharing one atmosphere, does not mean we are all in this together. Catastrophe will be manageable enough for the wealthy that it won't even feel like catastrophe. The world in 2100 will not be more dangerous for them than the world of middle-class Americans in 1950 or Gilded Age plutocrats in 1890. They'll be fine. So will most of their grandchildren. At least that's the bet. And that's enough. As long as enough voters identify with them, it will be true, for all relevant purposes, that you can build a wall to keep out climate change. At least in political time. Ecological facts won't save us. Only political responsibility for facts can even begin to save us. All of this intersects with arguments about how we should imagine the living world today. In this political moment, where everything seems to turn into a story about a global war of civilizations, which is the core of Trump advisor Steve Bannon's worldview, or a demand for a wall or an exclusion policy to end our anxiety and reestablish a sense of control, some humanities scholars with an ecological turn of mind would like to make alliances with a nature that seems to refute all of this. A nature that doesn't know borders or even species boundaries, where our biological identities are possible only because of aliens within us, the bacteria and portmanteau cells that form our so-called selves. A nature that is everywhere hybrid, queer, and unlike itself, let alone like any simple and sentimental idea of it that some of us might find comforting. To take an especially eloquent instance, the anthropologist Anna Tsing ties this picture of nature to an aesthetics and ethics, as she puts it, of precarity, surrendering control, relaxing presuppositions about who one is, being always open to surprise, from within or from without. Against myths like nation, let alone race, we can cultivate what she calls transient assemblages of affinity. Tsing thinks this is an anti-capitalist way of thinking. I'm pretty sure that it's the opposite, and that Silicon Valley consultants would love to explain how an ethics of precarity makes an insecure gig economy sound like a spiritual practice, and how transient assemblages show that unions and long-term employment are anachronisms. In any case, it is quite inadequate as a democratic way of thinking. It's inadequate because it does not take seriously what Thoreau insists upon, that democratic community is utterly real. It's as real as dirt because we're trapped in it, because the facts we majoritarian bandits choose become the facts we live with every day, because after you lose a country, you continue to wake up in it every morning. Thoreau's own conclusion in his essay on slavery in Massachusetts was a hopeful one. He came across a water lily in the swamp, and its sweet smell became a symbol of higher moral possibility. Thoreau does this again and again. At the end of Walden, he falls into uplift about following your dreams and doing what you love. And here, a flower becomes the counterpoint to slavery. Here I stop walking with him, and in this way I break, too, with what the philosopher Stanley Cavell wrote of Walden, quoting, that this book is perfectly complete, that it means every word it says. I recognize this is one way to read a sacred text, or relatedly a certain kind of law, sometimes attempted in constitutional law, with mixed results. But I find it indefensible as a way of listening to a companion. The assumption of perfection, always false, becomes a kind of interpretive totalitarianism, which can only be disappointed, and will have muddied up everything along the way. Instead, the thing is to hear Thoreau as someone who's caught in a situation whose outcome he doesn't know, where he has a lot of reason not to be optimistic, and where he's trying to find himself and find companions in a country that he's lost. The Thoreau I can hear is the one whose nature is not a simple comforter, but also not a simple mirror. It tugs and jostles him to new vantage points. He said he looked to mountains, the mountains he couldn't see in June, because, as he put it, their mere distance was a kind of encouragement. An opened view in space could open something in the mind. He wrote that when he bathed, he let his mind float down the stream and thought it was like seeing the earth from a distance, like coming unmoored from the thudding impact that reminds you with every step on the ground of exactly where you are. And in Walden, he wrote, "We're not wholly involved in nature. I may be either the driftwood in the stream or Indra in the sky looking down on it." We're talking here about ways of opening a compressed and desperate mind that the world's events are occupying like a hostile force. The Thoreau I come to, reading him these days, has something in common with Ta-Nehisi Coates in that he feels the accumulated violence of the country in his body. This is the Thoreau who wrote, defending John Brown's anti-slavery insurrection, "We preserve the so-called peace of our country by deeds of petty violence every day. Look at the policeman. Look at the jail. Look at the gallows. We're hoping only to live safely on the outskirts of this provisional army." He denounced anyone who hoped to see change come from what he called the quiet diffusion of the sentiments of humanity, answering as if the sentiments of humanity were ever found unaccompanied by deeds. The difference is in the way Thoreau lays claim to citizenship, to his citizenship not just as a privilege to be confessed, not just as an ideological trick to be unmasked, but as, you might say, his biggest problem, something utterly real from which he could not extricate himself, and for which there was no comfort, something that he needed to find complex ways to inhabit and understand and try to change from within. In the early 1980s, late 1980s and early 1990s rather, the political theorist Judith Shklar argued for what she called a liberalism of fear, a political ethics that oriented itself negatively, that took as its goal avoiding the worst things that people do, cruelty and the creation of needless fear. Because we should fear fear itself, she argued, we should also steer our politics away from what causes fear, what creates chances for cruelty. I don't think I need to spell out the relevance of this thought today, but I would like to supplement it with something I find in Thoreau. Call it a democratic citizenship of fear. Because this world is not given but made, because it needs to be remade better, but can also be remade much worse, and because each of us is part of all of that, both its victim and its author, and so responsible for it even as it harms us, we can't withdraw from it. But we can retreat from time to time to places where we can see more clearly, and the company of people, living and dead, who help us to see. There are many ways of doing this across all the landscapes people live in together, literal and otherwise. Landscapes of sound, landscapes of story and memory, rituals that have survived empires, the new rituals of a few friends in a bar saying just audibly, socialism and/or barbarism. The only claim that I make for certain old books is that they're reminders that we're not the first to have reason to be afraid for one another and ourselves, or to find ways to live through it and fight through it without losing our world. Thank you very much.
You know, I was reminded at one point in your talk, the morning after the election, I went out for a run, as I often do, and I was running down the street that Homie lives on. And on that street, there is a group of wild turkeys that moves about and that I often see. And on that particular morning, the turkeys were moving with a speed that was unprecedented in my experience down towards the river. And I had this lovely fantasy that they were like me trying to escape. And for me, the avenue of escape was not upwards, but always towards the river here in Cambridge. So you talked about a deranging fear, but I was hoping to embrace a kind of deranged joy, euphoria in that moment in identifying with the turkeys. I have questions, but I'm sure people here have questions, and I want to make sure that we can hear from as many as possible.
Well, speaking of wild turkeys,
Elsewhere, you've said that interspecies democracy is not possible, and you viewed that with sadness because of the linguistics barrier. But since a majority of species are non-human, that seems to be quite a contradiction in your notion of democracy, which is strictly anthropocentric. Which leaves the kind of conundrum that would we be better off with the kind of eco-fascism that puts the environment and the majority of the species ahead of the human species rather than vice versa as we have now?
So it's a quick change in tone, but a very valid one. Yeah, I think that we can't have politics in the specific sense of deliberately binding ourselves to terms for the architecture of our collective lives in the absence of potentially shared language. And so just as you say, I think the idea of interspecies democracy is available only as a kind of effort of the charitable, interpretive, political imagination, but not as an extension of our institutional forms. To the second question, no, but I think in some ways the answer can be given purely within politics in a way. I don't think it's in any way on in a politics that is ineradicably human. In some ways, the answer about the content of politics, I think, is given by the form of the linguistic species barrier. That may not altogether satisfy you, because it doesn't answer what's the sort of deeper thought, which is that maybe if we could stand outside ourselves, we could see that our whole pattern of activity on this planet is a kind of terrible tragedy for the rest of the planet, and that I don't deny as a real thought.
A wonderful and really thought-provoking talk. I was struck by your notion of losing a country, and seems to be a disconnect between, for me at least, losing a country and the way our elections run. So what I wonder about is if the Electoral College had gone differently by 100,000 votes, we would have a different president. But would you have lost your country any less? Is it you lose your country because of the way we do Electoral College, or wouldn't you lose your country either way?
It's it's a fabulous question. How can an if you will existential derangement arise from a weird and contingent trick of political arithmetic, right? And I think that the answer is on two levels. One, I think the sense in which I talked about losing a country was already afoot in the whole rise of the Trump phenomenon and the discovery that things were sayable and facts subject to reinvention and deployment in their new false form in ways that took many of us more by surprise than probably they should have done. So in that sense, the question, what have we failed to understand about where we are and what's happening, I think would have been an urgent question anyway. The second part of the response, though, is that I do think that there's a very basic way in which well, I'll put it this way. I think the premise of what I called a democracy of fear is that we really do make key features of our common world through the tricks of political arithmetic. And these guys certainly recognize the significance of having control of the state and of how much power it gives you to remake things. And of what it might mean to control the state without having a lot of regard for the traditional pieties of its administrative and governing classes. So in that sense, I think the world that those 100,000 votes bring into being is actually, in some relevant sense, a different country from a world in which they didn't happen, because the country doesn't only pre-exist politics, but follows on it.
Tommy?
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Very moving and elegiac reflection on the condition, the post-election condition, but also taking it back and beyond. And I'm going to ask you the kind of question that when I'm asked after a talk irritates me hugely. And it relates to the loss of the country and whether tying it to this moment and whether tying it to this deformation of language and fact and truth and verification that you talk about, and the kind of fog, the miasma that is created by the social media and when it's manipulated. But I want to ask you whether you shared with me the sense that a vital part of the country was being lost in the whole series of killings of black people, largely, and people of color too, on the streets, where a very different kind of imaginary, both of fear and anxiety, continually played with institutions that preceded the current, the current situation. And that Black Lives Matter or the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, or indeed the landscape of people literally walking across Europe, contacting Instagram and trying to see how they should hide for a night, frozen, wake in the morning, lost. I thought the world was losing itself then. Yes. And I thought that those were the issues that we would be facing and trying to confront. So I think in some echo with what was said before, what did we lose then? And how do we create another kind of retrieval of that moment? But what did we lose? Was the country not lost then too? Was the world not lost at that point?
So, Homie, thank you for that. It's a genuinely clarifying question for me. It makes me realize something I would have wanted to say. There's a version of this meditation that I don't like because it feels jejune to me, and that is the version that is summarized as, "Oh, my fragile liberal feelings, look what's happened." I think that I ought actually to have stayed more on the fact that Thoreau's saying that he has lost the country is also a way of acknowledging that he's been brought past his power to ignore what has been happening for a long time in the country, where he's made accommodations of imagination and identity up to the point where Anthony Burns is sent back by a decision of a federal judge in the Massachusetts courthouse. And there's something closely akin to that in the way that to allude to Coates again, the people that Coates calls the dreamers, people who have found a way to feel that they are not implicated in harm in their American lives, have been confronted with the fact of unaccountable state violence vividly over the last several years. In fact, I don't think I would have been able to make whatever feeble progress I did in thinking about what Thoreau was carrying here without having spent some time trying to think about what it was that the Black Lives Matter movement and its partly coincidental literary avatar in Coates's meditation were confronting people who had not known this fully enough before. So in that sense, I think the election is almost a very consequential synecdoche for something larger in which realities are coming into focus. It's not just that things are being broken or stripped from us. And it's very helpful.
Thank you so much. And I mentioned this because, just very quickly, just to say that, of course, what Ta-Nehisi Coates hits against the dreamers is the void. What he calls the void, the writers of the void, from whom he learned more. And,
Yes.
When he realized that the dream was lost, he learned from the void.
Yes.
And I think that's, again, synecdoche, that's again a kind of mechanism, that's again a symbol of the kind of issue of fear and the containment of fear. And yet, in some sense, the productivity.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jed, can I ask you a question about our role as teachers in this moment? One of the things that you indicated, which I think is resonant for many of us, is that we have long seen our role as taking students who enter the classroom with a sense of certainty and assumption, and we try to loosen up those assumptions and drag them into a place of uncertainty. But even as we have been performing this role, the merchants of doubt, right, coming first in the tobacco field and later, so to speak, and later in climate change have done a judo move on us, so to speak, and left us uncertain of our own pedagogical habits. And I was struck when you were talking about the extent to which, as we seek to enforce the constitutional restraints on presidential power, you said something to the effect, as if it were by divine decree. And I was thinking about that as if, right? And the kind of work that it's doing and the knotty problem it may represent for us. And I was wondering if you could say anything about that.
So, yeah, when I said those things, it's characteristic that you should seize on them in this connection. I was thinking really about a kind of shock that people who teach in the settings where I teach in law schools have been absorbing, because it is the heart of our pedagogical habits, I think, to respond to students who come to us with a sense of absolute stakes and vivid moral clarity, with respect to this set of authoritative public principles that they're learning to apply, manipulate, and engage. And we soften the grip of those felt absolutes on their minds. And we give them a mastery of a kind of tactical engagement with legal materials and principles. We're great modulators and relativizers. And I think there's a genuine form of intellectual maturity as well as professional mastery that in my world we give them. But I also think that when they come to us now, right now, asking questions like, is this normal? Is this how it feels after elections? Which my students have asked me. They're not sure, really. How would they be sure? Or are there uncompromisable values at stake here? Because they say, I feel there are. Am I wrong? I think the questions they're asking us are altogether valid, and I don't think it's been, in my world, our intellectual habit to address them on the same ground on which they're posed. I don't think I'm engaging the full body of what you invite me to reflect on, Robin. But that's where I am with these themes right now.
I think it was quite a direct response. Other questions?
So I wanted to ask you to shift from focusing on Thoreau to focusing on Anthony Burns, and to think about his loss, and to think about the students who come to ask not, is this what it feels like after an election, but will I be allowed to stay? Will they create a registry that bans me or my family? And discuss the politics of fear and citizenship from that perspective.
Yes, that's why Anthony Burns, of course, as you see immediately, because he was being sent back, because he was being expelled from his exclusion and expulsion from the body of the political community was being confirmed, as it would be in 2 years constitutionally in Dred Scott, through the bland movements of the law and the neutral application of constitutional language. In a way, this is gonna maybe, Doria, seem like a cop-out, but I wanted to go into the register of historical experience that I thought I had a kind of confident access to. I think my interpretive confidence about what it is to enter into this experience from the point of view of Anthony Burns is too shaky for me to try to go there. Except to say that Thoreau was trying to think about the significance of his legal linkage to what was made of Anthony Burns's life as a linkage that was psychic and moral and almost physical as well.
Other questions? Oh.
I just have had many thoughts, and I'll try to put a few of them out in order. And a lot of what you're talking about is empathy, and so to establish empathy, first of all, I want to say I live around the corner from where Homie Baba used to live, and I see those turkeys all the time when I walk my dog, and I really want to let my dog go and see what kind of empathy can happen amongst all of them. But I'm a little bit afraid that a car will come by just at the wrong moment. There are two kinds of losses of your country that I've felt. One is the operational, the Anthony Burns kind of loss of what's going to happen with the EPA and the Department of Justice and all that kind of stuff. That's horrible, and that, at least from my point of thinking, and vigilance is required there. But the other loss isn't really a loss, it's just a realization of something that wasn't there, which is that half of the country who voted, and we got to presume that the half that didn't vote is not going to be too much different from that, at least that's what I think. They don't think the way we think or the way I think. They think totally differently. And they have felt, I believe, from talking to friends of mine who voted that way, that their country has been lost for a long time. They've been living in the wilderness of the lost country, and that's what Take America Back is all about. And they've been scared and frightened that they can't protect their home or that they're not going to be able to afford to drive their car. And I thought that the talk was going to be a little bit more about the living in the post-truth, or the fact that all these things of science and rationality that we believe, they don't get, they don't care about, probably because their despair over all of this and the way they think of things is as deep as yours is now, and they care about different things. And that's where vigilance isn't going to help. Something totally different has to deal with half the country who doesn't think the way I think. That's what I thought we were going to hear more about today. Not that I was disappointed in what I did hear, but it's not going to make me go read Thoreau either. I think that's the bigger problem. The other problem is just a problem. We lost the election. Okay, it was close, but a lot of elections are close, and that's the way it goes. This is draconian. I mean, it's implementation, a draconian implementation of all the worst thoughts is going to happen, it seems. So it was a bad time to lose. But elections always are won and lost by somebody. But we really are seeing that there's a lot of people who think totally differently from a lot of other people. How do we deal with that?
When I thought that Hillary Clinton was likely to win the election, I thought the two most important questions in the aftermath would be the fate, on the one hand, of the continued effort to build a social democratic and strongly small d democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And second, what the defeated Trump forces would understand themselves to be and stand for going forward. I thought then that the biggest danger was the persistence of a constituency that would self-consciously regard itself as engaged in a sort of white Christian nationalist identity politics. It seemed to me, when I thought she would win, that this had the potential to present a terrible political dilemma in the country between normalizing that kind of politics on the one hand and anathematizing tens of millions of people who show up to vote on the other hand by treating them as outside the ordinary course of politics. So it turns out we don't have that choice. Yes. Did you say the joke's on us? Yeah. I've spent probably like many of us, a lot of time reading accounts like Arlie Hochschild's excellent study of right-wing anti-government sentiment among people in southern Louisiana, many of whom can only be called victims of environmental injustice, who are torn between candidates who want to defund the EPA and candidates who want to eliminate it outright. People she comes to like and even admire. And I've spent a lot of time reflecting on my own origins in a place, West Virginia, that was one of only 7 states to vote for Michael Dukakis over George H.W. Bush, and went about 77% for Trump this time. So much in how to put this. The frightening and hopeful thing about politics is the same thing, which is that people don't necessarily bring identities to it that are pre-political and persistent. To some extent, people are in politics as they're the people they're addressed as being. And they hope for the things and express the forms of resentment and indignation, as well as hope that they learn from one another that they are licensed to express. On the one hand, the Occupy movement seemed to open up a terrific kind of discursive permission to name the fact of deep and grinding inequality, and to name the aspiration for more egalitarian relations. And that has continued to have consequences. The Sanders campaign brought language into political life that had been dead and caricatural for decades. And the Trump campaign brought into politics things that had been unsayable, but evidently not altogether unsaid or unthought. So this is all just to say that this is a very long way of saying that I'm not sure that in 4 years or 8 years or 12 years or 20 years, it's going to be the same people with the same identities and the same epistemic habits having the same fights, because politics itself remakes who's there and redefines who's there for worse and for better. But it's precisely for that reason that I find I've no confident sense of exactly how bad things might get right now. So I didn't answer your question, then I posed a different one, and I didn't answer that one either. But that's the best I can do.
Maybe one more question? Yes, please.
Thanks for your talk and reflections and the questions as well. You spoke about the multiplicity of landscapes that we could kind of turn to or choose as points of disanchoring, but also potential community. And one of those was, sitting around with a friend in a bar and evoking the old slogan, socialism or barbarism. And that brought me to a question about, where and what is the landscape of social vision at this moment in time? How do we struggle, whether we feel we lost country just now or whether we've lost we never had a country, which many people of color and others feel. Where is the incentive in that sense that's going to, or how are we going to mobilize in such a way to allow for the creative emergence of such an incentive? And I was thinking, I just went to the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, which was a 3-day conference, and the title of it was "Where Do We Go From Here?" And it was conceived to draw in younger generational activists from Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, and so forth, to sort of work together to synthesize the legacy of the Panthers. And one of the Panthers' mottos, so to speak, was, for their community survival programs, was survival pending revolution. So that, there was a tremendous amount of work and commitment and engagement in the community survival programs on all levels. It's just sort of beginning to be understood, but there was that motive force. And I mean, the Panthers' notion of revolution changed also during their period of being, but there was that kind of momentum that generated action on the most basic community survival levels to other kinds of political actions. So anyway, I'm just asking you, if you would, just to reflect on that question a little bit.
Yeah. So, thank you. There are so many, I feel that I see where I want to go, and there are 3 or 4 threads of different colors in front of me, and I'm going to have to grab one or the other of them and then weave them together. So I'll just grab one sort of at random. So when I was spending a lot of time, and I was spending a lot of time reading Coates's book and trying to get hold of my responses to it, in part by going back to things that he was responding to, like the original Baldwin essay that was the model for his little book-length essay. The vast and palpable difference in 2 works that deliberately closely, the second deliberately closely tracked and echoed the first in a variety of ways, was the contrast between the encounter with the void, as Homie put it, and a kind of ungrounded struggle as the only thing available to live by in Coates's conclusion, to live unillusioned and just keep living. The contrast is to Baldwin's quite intensely linking the fate of Black people in America to the fate of the United States as a project of constitutional redemption, which he in turn linked to the fate of all humanity. Quite vividly and resoundingly, he sounded like a left-wing John Kennedy, right? So these are 2 big ways of orienting yourself to American history as something, on the one hand, that is where you've never had a country, as you put it, and the other as a country that somehow contains the seeds of its own incipient completion or perfection or something, even if that will always be a retreating horizon, which can only be achieved by confrontation with the fact of its own exclusions and its own violence. You can think of the second as a kind of redemptive constitutional picture. It's really the picture of Dr. King. It's the picture of LBJ's adoption of the civil rights vocabulary. On some level, it's even the Frederick Douglass view, though it's complicated, because Douglass also understands that the Constitution is something that needs to be made again by people. In some ways, I think neither of these is completely adequate now. The first, as I tried to say sort of obliquely at the end, because it doesn't, I don't like the slogan that it just doesn't offer hope. I think that's too simple and asks it to do the wrong thing. But there is ultimately a lack of sort of constructive political direction and orientation if you just stop at the end of that formulation, if you just stop there. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of reasons that the redemptive story is not one that we can take completely seriously on its own traditional terms at this point. It keeps failing on its own terms, too dramatically and vividly and concretely, in its disposition of the lives of human beings. But I would want to say, and this is where I want to grab the thread of your alluding to the deliberately self-consciously internationalist, anti-capitalist Black Panther Party. There are ways of thinking about making America great, and you can bracket the question of again, that don't depend on the idea of some deep-seated perennial American goodness or justice that can be finally completed and made whole. But instead understands itself as part of an international, intergenerational struggle for real dignity and self-government and security and shared power. I think it was very interesting this year that the two great sites of political energy, the Trump campaign on the one hand and Bernie Sanders' campaign on the other, were not constitutionalist in the way that they described their goals for the country, not historical in the utterly standard, almost mandatory American political register of telling the story of the watershed moments in national life and then saying, this is what we're going to bring to its consummation and make whole. It was something else. And each, in a way, was part of a certain kind of internationalism. The internationalism of the new nationalisms that people like Steve Bannon are trying to link Trumpism to, and an older and democratic and anti-racist internationalism that, of course, has its life within a country, but doesn't have to make a fetish of the country. And Thoreau's not always like that. But in these essays, I take him to be somewhat like that. Unillusioned about this American thing that he's caught in, but totally accepting, if with horror, that it's the thing he's got to work with. And I think that's part of why I went to him.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much. As we move forward, glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Father.